I've been thinking about the cost of getting into space. There's a lot of wishful thinking on this topic. If we could just get into space, if we could have launch vehicles that were reusable, that were air breathing, or some sort of magical fuel, boy, we should be able to get into, after all this time, we should be able to get into space for a lot less than $50 million or $100 million or $200 million, or in the case of the space shuttle, it'll cost $1 billion if you work out all the costs at least. We should be able to do better than that. If only we could just, reduce the cost of getting into space. Think of all the things we could do. We could go to Mars so much easier. We could go back to the moon. We could colonize the moon. We could get to asteroids so much easier, and we could afford to do mining there and bring back precious metals and so forth. And I understand that. It's a huge frustration. It's like, why can't we get into space and not have it cost so much? And the answer is because we've already tried, and we're already doing the best we can. We can wring out costs. We can play accounting games here and there. And I've often said if we had some sort of more of a production line approach, but even still, you're only building. How many launches are there in a year? It averages, in terms of launch to orbit, about once a week. That's 50 launches to orbit in a year. The local international airport puts that many airplanes in the air in 15 minutes, 20 minutes. Our experience is very low. We don't do this very often. We don't build many of these things. And because of that, we don't get the economies of scale. And we throw them away. We use them once and we throw them away not because we're wasteful, but because to save these pieces, to make rockets reusable, it makes them more inefficient. It means we have to save wings or landing gear, or we have to make them air breathing, or we have to save fuel, we have to have parachutes, and all of that makes them less efficient, which means they have to be bigger, which means it's harder to bring them back because they're bigger, and it's almost a catch-22, and we've looked at this, we've tried, and so maybe the other direction is, we'll sort of make engines on an assembly line. We'll stamp them out like Chevy Cavaliers, and you can do that up to a point, but you look at these things, and they're really complicated, not because people like to make things complicated, but because they're trying to burn a huge amount of fuel, at least the ones that are coming off the launch pad, the ones that are taking you into orbit. That's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about the rockets that are in space that can be a lot smaller and a lot more efficient because you have a lot more time. You're not in a hurry. You have to get off the pad quickly. Every second that you're spending getting into orbit, you're still feeling the pull of gravity. And so the sooner you can get into orbit, the less fuel it takes. So you need big engines. You need lots of fuel. And to control that is very difficult. It's very difficult. The difference between a rocket and a bomb is just a very, very fine amount of control. And so you have this situation where you have these really complicated, heavy machines. And they're heavy because the Earth's gravity is really a lot. If the Earth's gravity were 10% more than it is right now, there's no chemical process that we have that could get us into orbit. We would run out of fuel before we got into orbit. We'd have to orbit faster because there's more gravity, and we'd have more gravity to fight to get up there. And so add 10%, just 10%. So I'm saying that just to say that that's how close we are to not being able to do this at all. And so therefore, yeah, of course we have to have really big rockets, and they have to be really efficient. And even at maximum efficiency, you can't send an entire rocket up into space. You end up with too much rocket and not enough fuel. And so you have to throw it away. You have to throw parts of it away on the way up to get rid of the extra weight, the extra launch mass, so that when you get to orbit, you don't have all these huge rockets and huge empty fuel tanks. You've thrown them away already. So, okay, we talk about, well, the government way of doing things, maybe the military's way of doing things, and commercial rockets that are emerging. So-called commercial rockets. They're still mostly being purchased by the government, but I think there is a legitimate commercial market emerging. And the commercial market is able to reduce costs to some extent. They have some advantages. They have the advantage of being new. They don't have pensions. They don't have old facilities to maintain. They don't have I won't say antiquated bureaucracy, but established bureaucracies in need of revision. Maybe they don't have quite as many extraneous employees. And they tend to hire younger people out of college, can pay them less because they're inexperienced. Okay, as you gain experience, you get paid more. So the people working in the more established firms maybe are paid more because they have 20 years of experience building rocket engines or whatever. And it's like, well, how many people have that kind of experience? How many people know when something is about to go wrong, that it's about to go wrong, and hit the button, stop this test? Whereas somebody right out of college would say, oh, very nice explosion we just had. Wonder what happened. Companies like to pay a little extra for experience. They will. So a younger company has certain advantages, at least initially. And it may turn into up to a 50% reduction in the cost for their space vehicle versus a space vehicle or a launch vehicle versus those produced by the more established companies or by NASA. But ultimately, it's not that much different, and most analysts understand that the cost advantages that you're getting aren't going to last. Eventually, SpaceX is going to have a more mature employment situation. They're going to have, standards that they have to work towards that they didn't understand they had to work towards as they build bigger rockets and so forth. They'll have to have bigger testing facilities. If they want to build more of something, you can't just build them faster. You have to have bigger facilities, more facilities. So and that increases their overall costs. These things aren't being built like Chevy Cavaliers. They're not being stamped out one after the other. They're being essentially hand built, and they're being hand built to order. And if there's a downturn, and these huge facilities are empty for 6 months or a year, they still have their costs. They can lay off non-essential people, but you really don't want to lay off the people that know how to build these things. You may not ever get them back. So anyhow, I'm just saying that ultimately there's a reason why it costs $50 million or $100 million or $200 million or $1 billion to get something into orbit. Then the other side of the problem is that you're building a satellite, you're building a rover, you're building a space shuttle, you're building something that's going into orbit, and you're already committed to tens of millions of dollars to get it into orbit. And so, nobody spends $50 million or $100 million to put a $2 million spacecraft into orbit. Nobody does that. It doesn't make any sense. If you're going to spend $100 million already just to get your spacecraft into orbit, well, you want to get something for that. And so spacecraft tend to cost at least as much as the launch vehicle. It's almost a gut emotional sort of thing. Why would I, for instance, I want to go to the store and I'll rent a semi-tractor trailer for $1,000 a day or something. Who knows how much that really costs? Just to go to the store, and I'll pick up a loaf of bread and a frozen pizza or something, and I'll drive home. Nobody would spend that much money just to do something really ordinary. You would rent a semi-tractor trailer or do something like that if you were planning to ship all of your worldly goods across the whole country. Okay, now it's starting to make some sense. And so that's what's really going on, is that if you have this capacity, it's really expensive. Well, you don't want to just do a chintzy little spacecraft. What you can do sometimes is maybe you can tag along on a larger mission. There are secondary payloads that are possible. But if say you're the primary mission, you're going to Mars, you're going to orbit Mars, and it's already going to cost you $200 million for your Delta IV or your Atlas V or whatever to get there. You're just not going to have a chintzy little spacecraft. You're going to put a little extra into it. So, all right, so typically the emotional tipping point is that the spacecraft costs at least as much as the launch vehicle, and typically a lot more. But we'll just say that about the same. So now you're into this thing for hundreds of millions of dollars, and the people looking at the people that are responsible for the success of the mission are saying, "Oh my goodness, we're spending how much on this? How much testing did we do? We need to do more testing. We need to make sure that this thing's really going to work. Did you use any new parts? I mean, we got to use parts that we know work, that have already flown in space. Well, those are a lot heavier and more expensive. I don't care. We need to. This thing has to work. We can't spend hundreds of millions of dollars and not have this thing work." And so more testing happens. Spacecraft aren't built. They are rebuilt and rebuilt and rebuilt. They're torn apart, put back together, torn apart, put back together. When I used to design circuit boards for a spacecraft, I mean, this thing would be working, and there would be a delay, and it would be like, well, because say the launch vehicle wasn't ready or something, and so the prime contractor would say, we've got 6 months here. I mean, we can do something. What can we do to improve the reliability of this spacecraft over the next, well, maybe not 6 months, maybe a year or two, whatever. Something that you could actually accomplish something in a year or two. And I said, well, we would say, well, we could replace, these 2 or 3 circuit boards that they work just fine, but there's some wire patches and things we've done to get them to work, and we could relay them out from scratch and incorporate all of that. And then we'd say, sure. Or they would say, yeah, fine, go do it. Lay out those boards. And space-rated circuit boards are really expensive. And the parts are really expensive, and suddenly, we just spent on a tiny little spacecraft, we just spent another $2 million. And everybody's looking at each other saying, the ones that were in there, they worked just fine, and there's no reason that they weren't going to work. But, I mean, that's the sort of mentality, and I can understand it, because when you're sitting on a project that's going to cost you hundreds of millions of dollars, you're just not going to screw around. If you have a chance to improve the reliability, because once it's up in space, there's no factory recalls. There's no driving it back to the dealer to get it fixed if some light comes on or whatever. You're there, you're out there, you're hanging out there, and you've got to be as reliable as possible. And you've got a lot of skin in the game. You've got a lot of money on the table, and so that table is creaking under the weight of all of that money, and you really, 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 can't cut corners. And so, I mean, that's what really drives the cost. Is the real cost, and then the practical sensibility. If you're going to spend all that money on a launch vehicle, your spacecraft, may as well do something significant. And then everything gets complicated, and then you start worrying, oh my God, I have so much money on this, so we spend even more money to try to make it more reliable. So anyhow, that's the short answer. And if you want to do it on the cheap, you have to work against some things. You have to say, okay, we're going to cut corners. Essentially, that's what you're saying. We're not going to test as much. We're not going to rework as much. We're going to put it up on a less reliable launch vehicle with less legacy, fewer launches, fewer historical track record. We're going to, I mean, the things you have to do to be cheaper in space are really hard to sell. I mean, it's actually easier just to try to get more money than it is to try to talk people into, we're just going to cut corners. And when you cut corners, bad things happen. Absolutely. Bad things happen. I mean, sometimes you get lucky, but in space you really typically don't get very lucky. Physics in space, in particular, is an unforgiving environment. So anyhow, the next time you're wanting to go to Mars and you're saying, well, how come they're saying it costs like, $400 billion or $200 billion or $1 trillion? I mean, there's a reason. There's a reason. It's a really complicated analysis to get down to the bottom line, but there's a reason. And, it's the physics of getting off the Earth, the weight that's involved in getting things off the, of the fuel, the gravity and all that. And then, the cost that drives even more cost. You just don't want to screw it up. So the next time you want to go to Mars or the Moon, or you want to send out vehicles to mine asteroids, got to keep in mind that it's a pipe dream to think that it's ever going to be cheap. I don't think we're going to discover the warp engine. I don't think we're going to, we'll nickel it and dime it and we'll trim it and we'll polish it. But the bottom line is space will always be expensive, and you have ultimately you have to have a really, really good reason to go out there. That's really the answer. And if you can bring back knowledge, if you can bring back something that's worth that investment, okay, well, that's how it works. But to hope that you can do it on the cheap, 10 cents on the dollar, a penny on the dollar, isn't going to happen. It will never happen. It will never happen.